happened on a quiet street in Frankfurt, Kentucky, on May 3, 1992, wasn't just another statistic. It was the kind of disappearance that defies logic, that breaks every rule of how these cases usually unfold, and that leaves investigators with more questions than answers 3 decades later. A 3-year-old girl vanished from her own front porch in broad daylight, in less than 10 minutes, without a single scream, without a single witness, and without a single trace. This is the story of Angelica Lewis, and this is Cold Case. Before we go any further, if you believe that every missing child deserves to have their story told, that every family deserves answers, and that cold cases should never be forgotten, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, because the only way these cases get solved is if people like you refuse to let them fade into obscurity. Now, let's dive into one of Kentucky's most baffling unsolved mysteries. Some spring afternoons burn themselves into a town's memory forever, not because of sunshine or the sweet smell of fresh-cut grass, not because of children's laughter or the gentle sound of wind chimes singing in the breeze, but because of the moment everything changed, because of the moment when normal became nightmare, because of the moment when safe became something that could never be taken for granted again. Frankfurt, Kentucky, May 3, 1992. A Sunday afternoon. It was the kind of day when honeysuckle hung heavy in the humid air, when the temperature hovered in the mid-70s, when every window on every street stood open to catch whatever breeze might wander through. The kind of day when mothers hung laundry on clotheslines and fathers washed cars in driveways and children rode bicycles in endless circles around cul-de-sacs. The kind of day that felt safe, that felt normal, that felt like every other spring Sunday in small-town America. Frankfurt wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened, population barely cracking 10,000 souls. It was the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors knew each other's names and each other's business, where the biggest crimes were usually teenagers spray-painting the water tower or someone's dog getting into someone else's garbage. It was the kind of place people moved to specifically because they wanted to raise their children somewhere safe, somewhere wholesome, somewhere that felt like stepping back in time to a simpler America. Riverview Lane sat on the eastern edge of town, a modest street of small single-family homes built mostly in the 1960s and 70s. Nothing fancy, nothing that would catch your eye if you drove past. Just working-class homes with tidy yards, chain-link fences, basketball hoops over garage doors, and big wheels scattered across driveways. The kind of street where everyone worked hard, where most families had 2 cars that had seen better days, where people took pride in their homes even if those homes would never make the cover of any magazine. The Lewis family lived in a small blue house at 1721 Riverview Lane, 3rd from the corner, on the south side of the street. It was a compact ranch-style home, maybe 1,200 square feet, with white trim around the windows and a small covered front porch that couldn't have been more than 6 feet deep and 12 feet wide. A chain-link fence surrounded the backyard. The grass was freshly mowed. A small garden of tomatoes and peppers grew along the side of the house. Everything about it said normal. Everything about it said safe. Carol Lewis was 28 years old that spring, a stay-at-home mother who had put her career as a dental hygienist on hold to raise her daughter. Her husband, Michael, was 31, working as a shift supervisor at the paper mill 15 miles outside of town. They'd been married for 6 years, high school sweethearts who'd done everything by the book, waited until marriage, saved up for a down payment on their first house, started a family when they felt financially ready. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were happy. They were living the American dream in its most modest, most attainable form. And then there was Angelica, 3 years old, born February 14, 1989, a Valentine's Day baby with dark curly hair that her mother kept in 2 ponytails, one on each side of her head, secured with bright pink ribbons. She had her father's brown eyes and her mother's smile, that gap-toothed grin that made everyone who saw it smile back. She was small for her age, maybe 30 inches tall, weighing somewhere around 28 pounds. She had a tiny birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. She loved Sesame Street, especially Big Bird. She loved peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles with the crusts removed. She loved her stuffed bunny, a worn gray rabbit named Hoppy that she'd had since she was 6 months old. The fur loved nearly bald in places from constant hugging. She was 3 years old. She was someone's entire world. And in less than 10 minutes, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, she disappeared without a trace. The day had started like any other Sunday in the Lewis household. Michael had worked the overnight shift at the mill, coming home around 8 in the morning exhausted and ready for sleep. Carol had been up since 6 with Angelica, making pancakes for breakfast, the kind with chocolate chips mixed into the batter that made Angelica squeal with delight. After breakfast, Carol had given her daughter a bath, washing her hair with baby shampoo that smelled like lavender and honey, dressing her in a pair of pink corduroy overalls with a white t-shirt underneath, white socks with ruffled lace around the ankles, and pink sandals with Velcro straps. The morning had passed quietly. Angelica had played with her dolls in the living room while Carol tidied up the kitchen and threw a load of laundry into the washing machine that sat in a small alcove off the kitchen. Michael slept in the bedroom at the back of the house, his door closed against the noise of daily life. Around 11, Carol made lunch, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, Angelica's favorite. The little girl ate at the kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath her chair, not quite long enough to reach the floor, chattering away about the birds she could see through the window, about the game she wanted to play after lunch, about how Hoppy needed a Band-Aid because he had hurt his ear. After lunch, Carol moved the laundry from the washer to the dryer and started a second load, towels this time, because Sunday was laundry day and there was always more laundry when you had a 3-year-old. Angelica had asked if she could go outside, and Carol had said yes, but only on the front porch where she could see her. The backyard would have been safer, completely fenced in, but Carol was working in the kitchen and the kitchen window faced the front of the house, not the back. From where she stood at the kitchen sink, she had a clear line of sight to the front porch. It made sense. It seemed safe. So Angelica had taken Hoppy and gone out to the front porch, pushing open the screen door that squeaked on its hinges, that squeak that Carol kept meaning to oil but never quite got around to. The screen door had a spring that pulled it closed automatically, and Carol heard it snap shut behind her daughter. She glanced at the clock on the microwave. 2:37 in the afternoon. The front porch wasn't large, just a small concrete slab with 3 steps leading down to the front walk, covered by a simple overhang supported by 2 white wooden posts. There was a metal glider on one side, the kind that rocked back and forth when you sat in it, with faded blue cushions that Carol had bought at a yard sale. On the other side sat 2 plastic lawn chairs, and between them a small table where Carol sometimes sat in the evening with a glass of iced tea after Angelica had gone to bed. Angelica had climbed up onto the glider, her favorite spot, where she could rock back and forth and make the whole thing squeak with each movement. She'd settled in with Hoppy on her lap, and from the kitchen window, Carol could see her daughter's little legs, too short to reach the ground, swinging back and forth, those pink sandals catching the sunlight. It was a beautiful day. Temperature in the mid-70s, not a cloud in the brilliant blue sky, a light breeze that made the leaves rustle. The kind of day that made you grateful to be alive, grateful for small moments, grateful for the simple joy of watching your child play in the safety of your own front yard. Carol went back to folding the towels that were still warm from the dryer, standing at the kitchen counter where she could glance up through the window every minute or so. She remembered thinking about what to make for dinner, whether they had enough chicken in the freezer or if she needed to defrost some hamburger meat. She remembered thinking about how she needed to call her mother later, how she'd promised to come over sometime this week to help clean out the garage. Ordinary thoughts. Mundane thoughts. The kind of thoughts that fill the quiet moments of our lives. She checked on Angelica. 2:41. Still on the glider, still rocking, still playing with Hoppy. A car drove past slowly, Mrs. Henderson from 4 houses down, returning home from church. Carol waved through the window. Mrs. Henderson waved back. Carol folded another towel. And another. She glanced at the clock again. She looked up at the porch. The glider was still moving, rocking slightly back and forth from momentum, But Angelica wasn't there. At first, Carol's brain didn't process the absence. It was just empty space where her daughter had been moments before. Maybe she'd gone around the side of the house. Maybe she'd seen a butterfly and climbed down to follow it. Maybe she'd gone to the backyard, even though she'd been told to stay on the porch. 3-year-olds didn't always follow directions. 3-year-olds got distracted. 3-year-olds wandered. Carol set down the towel she was folding and walked to the front door. Not running yet. Not panicking yet. Just expecting to call her daughter's name and hear that familiar voice call back from wherever she'd wandered to. She pushed open the screen door, that same squeak, and stepped onto the porch. The glider was still rocking gently. Hoppy lay on the cushion, abandoned. "Angelica!" Carol called out, her voice calm, expecting an answer. "Angie, honey, where are you?" Nothing. "Angelica, this isn't funny." "Come back to the porch, sweetheart." The street was quiet, empty. No cars. No people. Just the sound of wind chimes from Mrs. Patterson's house next door and a dog barking somewhere several blocks away. Carol walked to the edge of the porch and looked left, then right. She walked down the 3 steps to the front walk and looked around the side of the house. Angelica. Her heart was starting to beat faster now, that first flutter of concern, not quite fear yet, but something close to it. She walked quickly around to the backyard, pushing open the gate in the chain-link fence, expecting to see her daughter playing in the grass or sitting in the sandbox that Michael had built last summer. The backyard was empty. Carol ran back to the front of the house, her heart really pounding now, that first sharp edge of panic starting to cut through her consciousness. She ran across the front yard to the sidewalk and looked up and down the street again, this time really looking, really searching. "Angelica!" Her voice was louder now, carrying an edge that made it different from a normal call, that made it sound like what it was, the beginning of something terrible. "Angie, where are you?" Mrs. Patterson was watering her garden next door, and she looked up at the sound of Carol's voice, confused at first, then concerned when she saw Carol's face. "Carol, what's wrong?" "I can't find Angelica," Carol said, and hearing herself say the words out loud made it real in a way it hadn't been just seconds before. "She was just on the porch. I looked away for just a few minutes and now I can't find her." Mrs. Patterson dropped her hose and came over quickly, a woman in her 60s who'd lived on this street for 30 years and had seen children grow up and move away. "Did you check the backyard?" "Yes." "She's not there." Maybe she went inside? Maybe she's hiding? But even as Mrs. Patterson said it, both women knew it didn't make sense. The screen door had that spring. It made that squeak. Carol would have heard it open and close. And even if somehow she'd missed it, Michael was asleep in the back bedroom. If Angelica had come inside, she would have made noise, would have called for her mother, would have done something. Still, they checked. Carol ran back inside the house, her voice taking on a quality that woke Michael from his sleep, that brought him stumbling out of the bedroom in his boxers and t-shirt, confused and disoriented. "What's going on? I can't find Angelica. Help me look." They tore through the house together. It wasn't a big house. It didn't take long. Angelica wasn't hiding under her bed or in her closet or behind the couch or in the bathroom or anywhere else in that small 1,200-square-foot space. Michael pulled on jeans and shoes and ran outside, and by then Mrs. Patterson had called to another neighbor, Mr. Dawson, from across the street, and he'd come over, and they were all calling Angelica's name. Carol looked at her watch. 2:54. 7 minutes since she'd last seen her daughter on the porch. 7 minutes that felt like 7 hours. 7 minutes that felt like the world had tilted on its axis and nothing would ever be the same again. Michael ran down the street, checking behind parked cars, looking in open garages, calling his daughter's name over and over. Mrs. Patterson went door to door, knocking, explaining, asking if anyone had seen a little girl in pink overalls. Mr. Dawson checked his own backyard and then the yards of the neighbors on either side of him. More people emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Henderson, who'd driven past just minutes before. The Rodriguez family from the corner house, the teenage Brennan kids from 2 doors down. Within minutes, a dozen people were searching, calling Angelica's name, checking every possible hiding spot in a 3-block radius. But there was no answer. No sound of a child calling back. No glimpse of pink overalls or dark curly hair with pink ribbons. Nothing. Carol stood in the middle of Riverview Lane, turning in circles, her mind refusing to accept what was becoming increasingly obvious. Her daughter was gone. Not hiding. Not playing some game. Gone. It was 3:09 when Michael ran back to the house and grabbed the phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. His voice was shaking too, barely controlled panic pushing at the edges of every word. My daughter is missing. She's 3 years old. She was on our front porch, and now she's gone. We've looked everywhere. Please. We need help. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, asking questions. How long had she been missing? What was she wearing? Did they have any reason to believe she'd been taken? Had there been any suspicious vehicles or people in the area? Michael answered as best he could, one hand gripping the phone so hard his knuckles had turned white, the other hand pressed against his forehead as if he could somehow hold his thoughts together through sheer force of will. Carol stood next to him, and he could hear her in the background, still calling their daughter's name out the front door, her voice getting hoarse, getting desperate. The first patrol car arrived at 3:23. Officer David Martinez, a 7-year veteran of the Frankfurt Police Department, had been the one to take the dispatch call. He'd felt his stomach drop when he heard "missing 3-year-old girl" come across his radio because he had a daughter the same age, because these were the calls that every police officer dreaded, because the statistics on missing children were not kind, and everyone in law enforcement knew it. By the time he pulled up to 1721 Riverview Lane, there were at least 20 people in the street, neighbors who'd joined the search, all of them calling Angelica's name, all of them checking and rechecking places that had already been checked. Carol met him before he'd even fully exited his patrol car, her words tumbling over each other. She was right there, right on the porch. I could see her from the window. I only looked away for a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes. She was there, and then she wasn't. She wouldn't just wander off. She knows not to leave the yard. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. Officer Martinez had done this enough times to know the drill. Most missing child calls ended quickly and happily. A kid wandered off to a friend's house without telling their parents. A kid fell asleep in a closet or under a bed. A kid was at a relative's house and there'd been a miscommunication, but something about Carol Lewis's face, about the genuine terror in her eyes, about the way her hands were shaking, made his training kick in hard and fast. He called for backup, multiple units. He established the last known location, the front porch, the glider still rocking slightly. He established the timeline, last seen at approximately 2:47. Discovered missing at approximately 2:54. Police called at 3:09. That gave them a window of roughly 22 minutes. If someone had taken Angelica, if this wasn't a case of a child wandering off, they had a 22-minute head start. By 3:30, there were 4 patrol cars on Riverview Lane. By 3:45, a sergeant had arrived to coordinate the response. By 4 o'clock, every available officer in the Frankfurt Police Department was either on Riverview Lane or en route. The scene transformed from a neighborhood of concerned people calling a child's name to something else entirely, something organized and systematic and terrifying in its implications. They established a command post on the Lewis family's front lawn. They brought in a canine unit, a German shepherd named Rex who'd been trained in search and rescue. They gave the dog one of Angelica's shirts from her laundry basket, let him get the scent, and watched as he immediately moved to the front porch, to the glider, then down the steps to the front walk. The dog circled there, nose to the ground, then moved to the curb and stopped. Just stopped. Sat down. Looked up at his handler with what could only be described as confusion. The handler, Officer Tom Richardson, a 20-year veteran who'd worked with search dogs for over a decade, felt his heart sink. He knew what it meant when a dog lost the scent at the curb. It meant the child hadn't walked away. It meant the child had gotten into a vehicle. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The command post on the Lewis lawn had grown from a simple folding table to a full operations center within an hour. More officers had arrived. The police chief himself, Chief Robert Wallace, a 58-year-old who'd been with the department for 34 years, stood at the center of it all, making decisions that would shape the entire investigation. This wasn't just a missing child anymore. This was a potential abduction. This was every parent's worst nightmare. This was the kind of case that could define or destroy a career, but more importantly, this was a little girl whose life hung in the balance. Detective Sarah Chen had been off duty, at home grading her son's science fair project, when the call came through. She'd left immediately, still wearing her weekend clothes of jeans and a university sweatshirt, arriving on scene at 4:15. At 36 years old, with 12 years on the force and 7 as a detective, she'd worked missing persons cases before. She'd worked child cases before, but something about this one made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The timeline was too tight, the scene was too clean, and the dog losing the scent at the curb was never a good sign. She started with the parents, because that's where you always started. Not because you assumed guilt, but because family members were always the last people to see a missing child, the ones who knew the most about their habits and routines, the ones who could provide crucial details. She sat down with Carol and Michael Lewis at their kitchen table, the same table where Angelica had eaten grilled cheese for lunch just a few hours earlier, and she asked them to walk her through every single detail of the day. Carol's voice was raw from calling her daughter's name. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She kept looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, each one taking her daughter further away. Michael sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders, his own face pale, his own hands clenched into fists on the table. They told Detective Chen everything. What time Angelica woke up, what she had for breakfast, that she'd taken a bath, what she was wearing, down to the specific pink ribbons in her hair, the pink corduroy overalls, the white t-shirt with a small yellow flower printed on the front, the white socks with ruffled lace, the pink sandals with Velcro straps. They told her about lunch, about the laundry, about Michael sleeping after his overnight shift. They told her about Carol's decision to let Angelica play on the front porch instead of the backyard because of the sight line from the kitchen window. "I could see her," Carol said, her voice breaking. "I could see her the whole time. I only looked away to fold towels. Just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes. She was there, and then she wasn't." Detective Chen made notes, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "Did you see anyone unusual in the neighborhood today? Any strange cars? Anyone walking past that you didn't recognize?" Carol and Michael looked at each other, trying to remember, trying to pull details from a day that had seemed so normal until it became anything but. Michael shook his head. "Nothing. It was just a regular Sunday. A few cars drove past. Mrs. Henderson came back from church. The Brennan kid was mowing his lawn earlier. That's it." "What about earlier this week? Has anyone come to the door? Salespeople? Repairmen? Anyone asking questions or taking an unusual interest in Angelica?" Again, they came up empty. No door-to-door salespeople. No repair work being done on the house. No strangers paying attention to their daughter. Nothing out of the ordinary. Detective Chen moved on to Angelica herself. Was she the kind of child who might wander off? Had she ever tried to leave the yard before? Would she go with a stranger? "No," Carol said firmly. "She knows not to leave the yard. We've taught her. She's a good listener. And we've talked to her about stranger danger. She wouldn't just go with someone she didn't know." But Detective Chen had been in law enforcement long enough to know that what parents believed their children would do and what children actually did in the moment of crisis or confusion were often two very different things. A 3-year-old was still just a 3-year-old, no matter how well taught. A friendly stranger with a puppy or candy or simply the right words could potentially lure even a cautious child. Outside, the search had expanded exponentially. It wasn't just neighbors anymore. The Frankfurt Police Department had called in mutual aid from the surrounding counties. Officers from 3 different departments were now working the search in a coordinated grid pattern, moving outward from the Lewis house in concentric circles. They searched every yard, every garage, every shed, every possible hiding place within a half-mile radius. They knocked on every door. "Did you see anything unusual? Did you see a little girl in pink overalls? Did you see any vehicles you didn't recognize? Did you hear anything around 3 o'clock this afternoon?" The answers were all variations of the same theme. No. Nothing. Everything seemed normal. Until it wasn't. The canine unit tried again, giving Rex a fresh scent article and starting from a different point, but the result was the same. The dog could track Angelica from her bedroom to the kitchen, to the front door, to the porch, to the front, walk to the curb, and then nothing. The scent ended at the street, as if she'd simply evaporated into the spring air. By 5:30, the FBI had been notified. In cases of child abduction, the FBI didn't wait for the mandatory 24 hours that television shows had taught everyone to expect. They got involved immediately, because the first hours were critical, because the statistics were brutal, because every minute that ticked by reduced the chances of finding a missing child alive. Special Agent Marcus Webb arrived from the Louisville field office at 6:47 that evening, bringing with him 2 other agents and a level of resources that the Frankfurt Police Department simply didn't have access to. Webb was in his early 40s, a veteran of the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit, and he'd seen enough of these cases to know that the next 24 hours would likely determine whether this story had a happy ending or became another tragic statistic. The first thing Webb did was establish a dedicated tip line. Within an hour, posters were being printed with Angelica's picture, a photograph Carol had taken just 2 weeks earlier at Angelica's 3rd birthday party, showing her gap-toothed smile and those pink ribbons in her hair. The poster included a detailed description: 3 years old, 30 inches tall, approximately 28 pounds, dark, curly hair, brown eyes, last seen wearing pink corduroy overalls, white t-shirt, white socks with ruffled lace, pink sandals. Anyone with information was urged to call immediately. By 7 o'clock that evening, as the spring sun finally began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across Riverview Lane, the full scope of the operation was becoming visible. The street had been closed through traffic. News vans from 3 different television stations had arrived, their satellite dishes extended, reporters doing live shots with the Lewis house visible in the background. A roadblock had been established at both ends of the street, with officers checking every vehicle, asking every driver if they'd been in the area that afternoon, if they'd seen anything unusual. The local news had started broadcasting Angelica's picture. The 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, breaking news interruptions on every channel. A 3-year-old girl missing from her own front porch in Frankfurt, Kentucky. Police asking anyone with information to come forward. The story was spreading beyond the local community now, reaching into living rooms across the region, into the consciousness of thousands of people who hadn't known Angelica Lewis existed an hour ago but who now felt invested in her safe return. Carol Lewis couldn't watch the news, couldn't stand to see her daughter's face on the television screen, to hear reporters calling it a suspected abduction, to listen to the carefully neutral language that refused to say what everyone was thinking. She sat in her daughter's bedroom, holding Hoppy, the stuffed bunny that Angelica had left on the porch glider, and she cried, not the loud, dramatic crying of movies, but the silent, soul-crushing crying of a mother whose child was missing and who had no idea if she was hurt or scared or calling for her mommy and unable to be heard. Michael had become the family spokesperson by necessity. He stood on the front porch, illuminated by camera lights that made the evening seem brighter than day, and he made a plea that would be broadcast on every news station in Kentucky and beyond. "Please," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "if you have our daughter, if you know where she is, please bring her home. She's just 3 years old. She needs her medicine." This was a lie. A calculated lie suggested by Detective Chen. Angelica didn't need any medicine, but if the person who had taken her believed she did, if they believed she was sick and needed treatment, it might make them panic, Might make them dump her somewhere public where she could be found. She's just a baby. Please, just let her go. Drop her off at a hospital, a police station, anywhere. No questions asked. We just want our little girl back. The local pastor, Reverend Thomas Mitchell from Frankfurt Community Church, had arrived at the house around 7:30, offering prayer and support. He'd organized a candlelight vigil for 8 o'clock that evening, and by the time Michael finished his televised plea, people were already gathering in the church parking lot 3 blocks away, holding candles and praying for a little girl most of them had never met. Detective Chen, meanwhile, was doing what detectives do. She was building a timeline, looking for gaps, looking for anything that didn't fit. She'd interviewed Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who'd driven past the house at approximately 2:41, just 6 minutes before Angelica was discovered missing. Mrs. Henderson was 72 years old, a widow who'd lived on Riverview Lane for 48 years, and she'd been coming home from the 11 o'clock service at Frankfurt Community Church. I waved at Carol through the window, Mrs. Henderson told Detective Chen, sitting in her living room, surrounded by decades of family photographs. She was in the kitchen. I saw her wave back, and I saw the little one on the porch, on that glider they have. She was playing with that stuffed rabbit of hers. Did you see anyone else? Detective Chen asked. Mrs. Henderson thought for a long moment, her weathered hands clasped in her lap. There was a car parked on the street, maybe 4 or 5 houses down from the Lewis place. On the same side. I noticed it because I didn't recognize it, and you know how it is in a neighborhood like this. You know everyone's cars. This was the first potentially significant lead. Can you describe the car? Dark-colored, blue maybe, or dark green. Hard to say for sure in the sunlight. Sedan. Not new, but not a beater either. Maybe 10 years old or so. Did you see anyone in the car? I didn't look that close, honey. I was just driving home. You know? Just another Sunday afternoon. If I'd known. Her voice trailed off, and her eyes filled with tears. If I'd known, I would have paid more attention. Detective Chen made detailed notes. A dark sedan, possibly blue or green, approximately 10 years old, parked on Riverview Lane sometime around 2:41. It wasn't much. But it was something. She radioed the information back to the command post, and within minutes, officers were knocking on doors again, asking if anyone else had seen this vehicle, if anyone had noticed who was driving it. Mr. Dawson from across the street had seen it too. He'd been in his garage, organizing tools, and he'd noticed the car parked on the street around 2:15 or 2:20. I figured it was someone visiting one of the neighbors, he told the officer who interviewed him. Didn't think anything of it. But yeah, it was there for at least 20 minutes, maybe more. Did you see anyone get in or out? No, sorry. I was in and out of the garage, wasn't really paying attention. Another neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner house, had been sitting on her front porch reading a book that afternoon. She'd seen the car too, noticed it because it had been parked in front of her house for a while before moving down the street. Maybe around 2 o'clock, 2:15, she told Detective Chen. Dark blue, I think. But I figured they were early for a visit or waiting for someone or maybe lost and checking a map. Did you see the driver? Not really. I glanced over a few times, but I couldn't make out any details from my porch. The sun was reflecting off the windshield. I think there was someone in the driver's seat, but I couldn't tell you anything about them. Male, female, young, old. By 9 o'clock that evening, as darkness fully settled over Frankfurt, the search teams had expanded their grid to a 1-mile radius. Volunteers had shown up, dozens of them, people from all over town and even from neighboring communities. The police had to turn some away, had to explain that in a potential abduction case, they needed trained searchers who knew how to preserve evidence, not well-meaning civilians who might inadvertently contaminate a crime scene. But they put the volunteers to work in other ways, passing out flyers, checking in parking lots and shopping centers, searching the woods that bordered the eastern edge of town, calling out Angelica's name into the darkness, hoping against hope to hear a small voice call back. The candlelight vigil at Frankfurt Community Church drew over 200 people. They sang hymns and said prayers and held their candles high, and Reverend Mitchell led them in asking God to watch over Angelica wherever she was, to keep her safe, to bring her home. The local news filmed it, those 200 points of light in the darkness, and the image would be broadcast across the state, a community united in hope and fear. Carol and Michael didn't attend the vigil. They couldn't leave the house, couldn't leave in case there was news, in case the phone rang, in case somehow Angelica found her way home. They sat together on the couch where just that morning they'd watched cartoons with their daughter, and they held hands and waited for information that refused to come. Special Agent Webb had set up his command center in the Lewis's living room, laptop open, phone constantly ringing with updates from various teams. Every lead was being run down. Every tip was being investigated. The dark sedan had become the focus of the investigation, but so far, no one had been able to provide a license plate number or a more specific description of the driver. The FBI had also brought in a criminal profiler, Dr. Elizabeth Morris, who'd spent the last 3 hours reviewing everything they knew about the case. At 10:30 that evening, she sat down with Webb and Chen to share her preliminary assessment. "If this is an abduction," she began, and everyone in the room noted that critical if. "We're looking at someone who was watching the house, who knew the family's routine, who knew that Angelica was often on that front porch. This wasn't random. This was planned." "What about the timeline?" Chen asked. "They had less than 10 minutes, which suggests they were waiting for their opportunity. They may have been parked on that street for extended periods over multiple days, learning the patterns. The mother looks away for 5 minutes. That's their window. And they move fast. In and out. Possibly on foot. Possibly in a vehicle. The dog lost the scent at the curb," Webb noted, "which suggests a vehicle. But that doesn't necessarily mean they got into a vehicle there. They could have carried the child to a vehicle parked elsewhere. Could have walked to a vehicle parked in an alley or around the corner. The scent ending at the curb just tells us that's where the trail from the porch ends." "Profile?" Webb asked. Dr. Morris hesitated. "Profiles were never certain, were always more art than science, especially this early in an investigation. If this is an abduction, we're likely looking at one of 3 types. First possibility, someone who knew the family, someone with access to or knowledge of their routine, a neighbor, a family friend, someone who'd been in the house or in the neighborhood enough to watch and plan. Second possibility, an opportunistic predator, someone who saw the child and took advantage of a momentary lapse in supervision. Third possibility, the most disturbing, a planned abduction by someone with a specific intent, whether that's ransom, which seems unlikely given the family's modest means, or worse. No one needed her to elaborate on what worse meant. "We're running background checks on everyone in the neighborhood," Webb said. "Everyone, within a 3-block radius. Looking for anyone with a history of crimes against children, anyone with a criminal record, anyone who raises red flags." By midnight, they had run background checks on 47 residents of Riverview Lane and the immediate surrounding streets. Most came back clean. A few minor infractions. 1 DUI. 1 domestic disturbance call from 3 years ago that had been resolved without charges. Nothing that screamed child predator. But there was one that made everyone pause. A man named Dennis Kowalski, age 46, who lived alone in a small house 6 blocks from the Lewis family. He'd moved to Frankfurt 8 months earlier, and his background check revealed a conviction from 12 years ago in Ohio for attempted abduction of a minor. He'd served 6 years in prison and been released on parole 4 years ago. He'd registered as a sex offender, as required by law when he'd moved to Frankfurt, but that registration had happened at the sheriff's office and hadn't been widely publicized in the community. At 12:47 in the morning, as Angelica had been missing for approximately 10 hours, a team of FBI agents and local police officers knocked on Dennis Kowalski's door. He answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, bleary-eyed and confused, and within minutes found himself sitting in an interview room at the Frankfurt Police Department. Special Agent Webb conducted the interview personally. Kowalski was advised of his rights, agreed to speak without an attorney present, and seemed genuinely confused about why he'd been brought in. "I don't know anything about a missing girl," he said, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his voice steady. "I saw it on the news. Yeah. That's terrible, but I don't know anything about it. Where were you today between 2 and 4 in the afternoon?" "At home. I work nights at the distribution center in Lexington. I sleep during the day." "I was home sleeping. Can anyone verify that?" "No, I live alone. But you can check with my employer. I worked last night. Got home around 9 this morning. And I was planning to sleep until I had to go back in tonight." "Do you own a car?" "Yeah, a '92 Ford Taurus. It's parked in front of my house." "What color?" "Maroon. Not blue or green." Not a match to the witness's description of the sedan seen on Riverview Lane. But that didn't mean he couldn't have had access to another vehicle. "Have you ever been on Riverview Lane?" "I don't even know where that is. I work, I sleep, I keep to myself. I don't go anywhere. I don't need to go. I've been clean for 4 years. I did my time. I'm just trying to live my life." They kept him for 6 hours, asking the same questions different ways, looking for inconsistencies in his story, waiting for him to slip up. But his story never changed. He'd been home, sleeping. He didn't know the Lewis family. He'd never been on Riverview Lane. His car was the wrong color. And when they finally checked with his employer, his supervisor confirmed that yes, Dennis Kowalski had worked the overnight shift from 11 p.m. the night before until 7 a.m. that morning. And yes, he was scheduled to work again that night. They had to let him go. There was no evidence connecting him to Angelica's disappearance. No evidence he'd even been in the area, just a prior conviction that made him a convenient suspect, but didn't make him guilty of this crime. The sun rose on May 4th, 1992, on a town that hadn't slept. The search teams had worked through the night, using flashlights and portable spotlights, covering every inch of ground within a 2-mile radius of the Lewis house. They'd searched the woods, the creek that ran behind several properties, an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a construction site where a new subdivision was being built. They'd found nothing. No sign of Angelica. No pink overalls. No small sandals. No evidence that she'd ever been in any of these places. Carol Lewis hadn't slept either. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's face, heard her daughter's voice, imagined her daughter calling for her, scared and alone, wherever she was. Michael had dozed fitfully on the couch for maybe an hour around 4 in the morning, but his sleep was filled with nightmares, and when he woke up, gasping and disoriented, the reality of their situation was somehow worse than any dream. Detective Chen had stayed at the house through the night, along with a victim advocate from the state, a woman named Patricia Langford, whose job was to support families in exactly this kind of crisis. Patricia had made coffee, had answered the phone when friends and family called, had dealt with the reporters who tried to get comments, had done all the small, practical things that needed doing when a family's world had fallen apart. Monday morning brought a shift change in personnel but no let-up in the investigation. Fresh officers and FBI agents took over from those who'd been working since the previous afternoon. The search grid expanded to a 3-mile radius. The tip line had received over 100 calls overnight, and each one had to be investigated. Each one had to be run down, even the ones that seemed implausible or came from people who were clearly not credible. At 8:15 that morning, a woman called saying she'd seen a little girl matching Angelica's description at a rest stop on Interstate 75, about 40 miles south of Frankfurt. Officers were dispatched immediately, reviewed security footage from the rest stop, interviewed the gas station attendants. The little girl turned out to be a 4-year-old traveling with her family, wearing pink, but not matching Angelica's description upon closer examination. At 9:30, a man called saying he'd seen suspicious activity near the old railway depot on the north side of town. He'd seen a man and a child getting into a dark car around 3 o'clock the previous afternoon. A team investigated, found that the railway depot had been closed and locked, found no evidence of recent activity, and eventually determined that the caller had been well-intentioned but mistaken about the timing. He'd actually seen something on Saturday, not Sunday. At 10:45, a woman called saying she'd had a psychic vision of Angelica near water, near a bridge. This lead was logged but given lower priority, though nothing was entirely dismissed at this stage. The news coverage had gone regional by Monday morning. Stations from Louisville, Lexington, and even Cincinnati were covering the story. Angelica's face was on the front page of every newspaper in Kentucky. The story had that terrible combination of elements that made it media catnip. A young, photogenic child, a daylight disappearance from her own front porch, a seemingly safe neighborhood, a loving family. It was every parent's nightmare, and it was compelling in the worst possible way. By Monday afternoon, the FBI had expanded their investigation to include a review of all registered sex offenders within a 50-mile radius of Frankfurt. There were 43 names on the list, and each one would need to be interviewed. Each one would need to have their whereabouts verified for the relevant time period. Meanwhile, Detective Chen was focused on something that had been bothering her since the previous evening. The timeline. She kept coming back to those 10 minutes, the window between when Carol had last seen Angelica on the porch at 2:47 and when she'd discovered her missing at approximately 2:54. 10 minutes. Maybe less. It was such a narrow window. She walked the scene again, standing at the kitchen window where Carol had been standing when she'd last seen her daughter. From this angle, she could see the front porch clearly, could see the glider where Angelica had been sitting, could see the front steps, the front walk, the curb. The sightline was good, clear, unobstructed. She walked out to the front porch, sat on the glider where Angelica had been sitting. From here, she could see up and down the street, could see Mrs. Patterson's house to the left, could see Mr. Dawson's house across the street. If someone had approached from either direction, walking or in a vehicle, it would have been visible. They would have had to be fast, incredibly fast, to park, approach the porch, take the child, and leave within that narrow window without being seen, unless they'd been waiting closer. Unless they'd been on foot, hiding somewhere with a clear view of the porch, waiting for Carol to look away. The houses on either side had shrubs and trees. The Dawson house across the street had a large oak tree in the front yard. Someone could have been watching from behind that tree, could have seen Carol turn back to her laundry, could have moved quickly across the street, up the porch steps, grabbed Angelica before she could scream, and disappeared around the side of the house or into a vehicle parked nearby. But that required knowledge, required knowing that Carol would look away, that she was doing laundry, that there would be a window of opportunity. It suggested someone who'd been watching for a while, someone who knew the family's routines. Chen went back to the neighborhood canvas, interviewing residents again, asking different questions. Had anyone noticed someone hanging around the neighborhood in the days before Angelica's disappearance? Anyone sitting in a parked car for extended periods? Anyone walking past the house multiple times? Anyone who seemed out of place? It was during this second canvass that Mrs. Patterson remembered something. There was a man, she said, sitting in her kitchen with Detective Chen. Last week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday. He came to my door, asking if I needed any yard work done. Said he was doing odd jobs in the neighborhood. I told him no, thank you. I have a service that handles my yard. Can you describe him? White, maybe mid-30s. Average height, average build. Brown hair, I think, or maybe light brown. He was wearing jeans and a dark t-shirt. Did he give you a name? I don't think so. Or, if he did, I don't remember it. Did you see where he went after you talked to him? He went next door, to the Lewis house. I saw him knock on their door. This was significant. This man had been at the Lewis house just days before Angelica disappeared. Chen called Carol immediately. Do you remember someone coming to your door last week asking about yard work? Carol thought for a moment. Yes, actually. Wednesday, I think. I was giving Angie a snack, and someone knocked. It was a man, youngish, asking if we needed any landscaping or yard work. I told him, my husband handles our yard, and he thanked me and left. Did he ask any questions? Did he try to look inside the house? No, nothing like that. It was maybe a 30-second conversation. He was polite. I didn't think anything of it. Did he interact with Angelica at all? Could he have seen her? Carol's face went pale as she realized where Chen was going with this. She was at the kitchen table. The door was open, just the screen door. He could have seen her. Oh my God, he could have seen her. What did he look like? I don't know. Average, I guess. Brown hair. Jeans. I wasn't really paying attention. I was focused on Angelica and her snack. I just wanted to get rid of him so I could get back to her. This man became the new focus of the investigation. Officers went door to door asking if anyone else had been approached by someone offering yard work services. 3 more families reported similar visits, all within a 4-block radius of the Lewis house, all within the same week. But none of them could provide a detailed description, and none of them had gotten a name or any contact information. 2 families had security cameras. One family had a doorbell camera that had captured the man on Wednesday afternoon. The footage was grainy, shot from above, showing the top of the man's head mostly, but it was something. The FBI's image analysts enhanced the footage as much as they could, pulling a still image that showed a white male, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 6 feet tall, medium build, brown hair, wearing jeans and a dark blue or black t-shirt. The image was distributed to every law enforcement agency in the region, sent to media outlets, posted online. "Have you seen this man?" the posters asked. "He may have information crucial to the Angelica Lewis case." The tips started flooding in immediately. Dozens of calls from people who thought they recognized him, who'd seen someone matching that description, who had theories and hunches and suspicions. Each tip generated paperwork, generated follow-up, generated hours of investigative work, and yet none of them panned out. The man remained unidentified. By Tuesday, May 5th, Angelica had been missing for 48 hours. The search radius had expanded to 5 miles, incorporating teams from 6 different law enforcement agencies and over 300 volunteers. They'd searched residential areas, commercial districts, industrial zones, parks, playgrounds, and miles of wooded areas. They'd dragged the creek. They'd used thermal imaging cameras to search vacant buildings. They'd brought in additional K9 units, bloodhounds that were specifically trained in tracking, and they'd followed those dogs through neighborhoods and fields and along roads, but every trail led nowhere. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit was now fully involved. Looking at the case from every possible angle, they'd built a psychological profile of the potential abductor, analyzed the specific circumstances of the abduction, and developed several working theories. Theory 1. This was a targeted abduction by someone who knew the family or had been watching the family. The yard work man was the prime suspect in this scenario. He'd approached multiple houses in the neighborhood, potentially casing them, potentially looking for vulnerable children. He'd seen Angelica through the screen door. He'd returned on Sunday, perhaps watching from the dark sedan that witnesses had reported, waiting for his opportunity. When Carol had turned away to fold laundry, he'd struck, moving quickly, possibly having planned his exact approach and escape route in advance. Theory 2. This was a crime of opportunity by a predator who happened to be in the neighborhood. The dark sedan was central to this theory as well, but in this scenario, the driver was simply cruising, looking for vulnerable children, and happened upon Angelica alone on the porch. Seeing his chance, he'd acted impulsively, grabbing her and leaving before anyone could respond. Theory 3. The one that law enforcement discussed quietly among themselves but tried not to think about too much. This was an inside job or involved someone very close to the family. The statistics supported this. Most child abductions were committed by family members or people known to the family, but interviews with Carol and Michael had revealed no marital problems, no custody disputes, no reason for anyone in the family to harm Angelica. Both parents had been polygraphed and had passed. Extended family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, had all been interviewed and cleared. Still, this angle couldn't be completely dismissed. Theory 4. The one that no one wanted to voice. Angelica had wandered off, despite what her parents believed about her obedience and caution, and had met with an accident. had fallen into a drainage culvert or a well or some other hazard that hadn't been discovered yet. This theory was given less weight as the search area expanded and every possible hazard was checked and rechecked, but it remained a possibility. The Lewis family had established a base at their house that had become a kind of command center for concerned community members. The kitchen table was covered with maps, with volunteer schedules, with stacks of flyers that needed to be distributed. The phone rang constantly. Friends and family came and went, bringing food that no one ate, offering support that felt inadequate in the face of such enormous loss. Carol's mother had driven in from 2 states away, arriving Monday evening and immediately taking over some of the household tasks that Carol couldn't focus on. Michael's parents had come too, his father, a quiet man who sat in the living room with red-rimmed eyes, his mother, a bustling woman who threw herself into making coffee and answering phones because doing something, anything, was better than sitting still with her thoughts. The strain on Carol and Michael was visible to everyone around them. They moved through their house like ghosts, speaking in monotones, existing in that terrible limbo between hope and despair. They'd done another televised plea on Monday evening, Michael once again standing in front of cameras, his voice stronger than his spirit, begging whoever had taken his daughter to let her go, offering the promise of no questions asked, just please bring her home. The reward fund had grown to $50,000 by Tuesday morning, contributed by local businesses, by community members, by strangers across the state who'd seen Angelica's face on the news and felt compelled to help. $50,000 for information leading to Angelica's safe return or to the arrest and conviction of whoever had taken her. Detective Chen had barely left the Lewis house since Sunday afternoon. She'd caught maybe 4 hours of sleep in the last 48, catnapping on the Lewis's couch when exhaustion absolutely demanded it. She'd changed clothes once, running home for a quick shower and a fresh outfit while another detective maintained presence at the house. She'd eaten when Patricia Langford forced food on her, barely tasting whatever it was, mechanically chewing and swallowing because her body needed fuel, even if her mind wasn't interested. She'd interviewed every single person who lived within a 6-block radius of the Lewis house. She'd followed up on every tip that had come through the hotline. She'd reviewed security footage from every business and residence that had cameras within a mile of Riverview Lane. She'd built a timeline so detailed that it accounted for every minute of Sunday, May 3rd, from the moment Angelica woke up until the moment the first police officer arrived on scene. And yet, she was no closer to finding Angelica Lewis than she'd been on Sunday afternoon. By Wednesday, May 6th, the media coverage had reached saturation point. Angelica's case was national news now. CNN had picked it up. The major networks had picked it up. Her face was everywhere, on television screens and newspapers and milk cartons and bulletin boards in grocery stores and post offices. Everyone in America, it seemed, knew about the little girl who'd vanished from her front porch in Frankfurt, Kentucky. The national attention brought its own complications. Celebrity psychics called offering their services, claiming they could locate Angelica through their supernatural abilities. Conspiracy theorists flooded online forums with increasingly bizarre theories involving everything from government cover-ups to alien abductions. The tip line was overwhelmed, receiving hundreds of calls a day, most of them from well-meaning people who thought they'd seen Angelica somewhere, but some of them from cruel people who called with false information, who claimed to have her, who demanded ransom, who got some sick satisfaction from adding to the family's pain. Every lead had to be investigated. Every call had to be taken seriously because the one that got dismissed might be the one that mattered. Law enforcement was running down tips from all 50 states. A woman in Oregon who'd seen a child matching Angelica's description at a shopping mall. A man in Texas who'd noticed suspicious behavior at a highway rest stop. A teacher in Florida who thought one of her new students looked like Angelica's picture. None of them were Angelica. The FBI had also begun looking at similar cases, unsolved child abductions from the surrounding states and region, looking for patterns, looking for any connection that might point to a serial offender. They found 3 cases within the past 5 years that had some similarities. Young children, taken from seemingly safe environments, never recovered. But the similarities were general enough that they might be coincidental, and different enough that they might not be related at all. On Thursday, May 7th, 5 days after Angelica's disappearance, the search shifted subtly but significantly. The massive, organized search efforts, while not abandoned, were scaled back. Reality was setting in. If Angelica was alive, she was likely far from Frankfurt by now. If she wasn't alive, well, the statistics on finding remains were grim, and there were thousands of square miles that could hide one small body. The focus turned more heavily to investigation than search, to building cases against potential suspects, to following paper trails and electronic trails, to surveillance of individuals who'd raised red flags, to the painstaking, unglamorous work of detective work that television shows rarely showed because it was boring to watch but essential to solving crimes. The yard work man remained the primary person of interest, but despite the widespread distribution of his image, despite hundreds of tips, he hadn't been identified. It was as if he'd been a ghost, appearing in the neighborhood for a few days, making his rounds, and then vanishing as completely as Angelica herself had vanished. The dark sedan had been another dead end. Police had investigated every blue or green sedan registered in the county, had interviewed the owners, had searched vehicles when consent was given or warrants were issued. Nothing had connected any of these vehicles to Angelica's disappearance. Carol Lewis had stopped sleeping entirely. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her daughter's face, heard her daughter's voice, imagined her daughter calling out for mommy in the darkness. Her doctor had prescribed sleeping pills, but Carol refused to take them. What if Angelica came home and she was too drugged to wake up? What if Angelica needed her and she wasn't alert enough to respond? So she stayed awake, fueled by coffee and terror and a mother's desperate hope that refused to die no matter how many days passed. Michael had gone back to work on Thursday, not because he wanted to, but because they needed the income. Because their health insurance was through his employer, because sitting at home waiting for news that never came was driving him insane. He worked his shift at the paper mill like a robot, going through the motions, his mind elsewhere, his supervisor and co-workers giving him space and sympathy, but unable to do anything that actually helped. The house on Riverview Lane had become a memorial of sorts. The front porch where Angelica had last been seen was covered with flowers and stuffed animals and candles, left by neighbors and strangers, people who wanted to do something, anything, to show they cared. The teddy bears and balloons accumulated day by day, until the small porch was overflowing with tributes to a little girl who might never come home to see them. On Saturday, May 9th, exactly 1 week after Angelica's disappearance, Frankfurt Community Church held another vigil. This one was different from the first. The first had been infused with urgent hope, with the belief that Angelica would be found at any moment, that they were praying for her safe return. This one, a week later, had a different feeling to it. Not hopeless, not yet, but more somber, more resigned to the reality that each day that passed made a happy ending less likely. Reverend Mitchell spoke about faith in the face of uncertainty, about trusting in God's plan even when that plan made no earthly sense, about continuing to pray and hope even when hope felt like the most fragile thing in the world. Carol sat in the front pew with Michael, and she didn't cry anymore because she'd cried so much in the past week that it felt like she had no tears left. She just sat there, hollow-eyed and exhausted, holding Michael's hand, staring at the cross at the front of the church, and wondering what kind of God would let this happen to her baby. Detective Chen attended the vigil, not as a detective, but as a human being who'd become far too emotionally invested in this case. She stood in the back of the church, watching Carol and Michael, watching the community come together in grief and solidarity, and she made a silent promise to herself and to Angelica that she would never stop looking, never stop investigating, never let this case go cold, no matter how much time passed. But even as she made that promise, she knew the reality. Cases went cold. Leads dried up. Resources got allocated elsewhere. Life went on, even when it felt like it shouldn't, even when it felt obscene that the world could keep turning when a 3-year-old girl was missing. By the end of May, 3 weeks after Angelica's disappearance, the daily press conferences had stopped. The news vans had moved on to other stories. The volunteers had returned to their regular lives. The massive search operation had been scaled down to a core team of investigators who continued to follow up on leads as they came in. But those leads were fewer and further between now. The FBI maintained involvement, but the day-to-day investigation was primarily in the hands of the Frankfurt Police Department, with Detective Chen as the lead investigator. She had a corkboard in her office covered with photographs, with timelines, with maps showing the search areas, with notes about every person of interest, every potential lead, every theory they'd explored. She stared at that board for hours every day, looking for something she'd missed, some connection she hadn't made, some detail that would break the case wide open. Carol and Michael tried to return to some semblance of normal life, though nothing would ever be normal again. Carol couldn't bring herself to pack away Angelica's toys or clothes. Angelica's room remained exactly as it had been on May 3rd, frozen in time, waiting for a little girl who didn't come home. Michael went to work every day and came home every evening, and they existed together in their grief, sometimes talking about Angelica, sometimes unable to talk at all, just sitting in silence in the house that felt too big and too empty, without their daughter's laughter filling it. The reward fund had grown to $75,000, but no one had come forward with information that led anywhere. The tip line still received calls, but they'd slowed to a trickle, and most of them were either obviously false or impossible to verify. Summer arrived in Frankfurt, bringing heat and humidity and the kind of bright sunny days that should have been filled with a 3-year-old's laughter. Carol couldn't look at other children without feeling her heart break anew, couldn't see little girls in pink dresses or with their hair in ponytails without having to turn away, blinking back tears. Michael had lost 20 pounds, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, moved through his days like a man underwater, everything muffled and distant and surreal. Detective Chen continued to work the case, but she had other cases now too, other crimes that demanded her attention, other victims who needed justice. She never forgot about Angelica, checked in with Carol and Michael weekly, followed up on any new tips that came in. But the reality was that the investigation had stalled. They had no viable suspects, no physical evidence, no witnesses who could provide the crucial details that would crack the case open. The yardwork man, despite his enhanced image being distributed across the country, had never been identified. It was possible he'd left the region after Angelica's disappearance. It was possible he'd seen the news coverage and gone underground. It was possible he wasn't involved at all, was just a transient handyman trying to drum up business who'd had terrible timing. But he remained the closest thing to a lead that investigators had, and every few weeks, Chen would pull his image out and look at it again, memorizing his features, hoping that someday, somehow, she'd see that face and be able to put a name to it. The case wasn't closed, but it went cold. Not all at once, not with any official declaration, but in the way that these things do. Slowly, gradually, day by day and week by week, as other priorities took precedence, as the trail went from lukewarm to icy, as the initial urgency faded into grim acceptance of a hard reality. By the first anniversary of Angelica's disappearance, May 3rd, 1993, the case file was still open, but it sat in a filing cabinet in Detective Chen's office, one of several cold cases that she vowed to revisit whenever time permitted. The anniversary brought a renewed flurry of media attention, the local news doing retrospective pieces, asking if anyone remembered anything, reminding the public that Angelica was still missing, that the investigation was still active, that any information, no matter how small, could be the key to solving the case. Carol and Michael marked the anniversary privately, not wanting the attention, not wanting to relive the worst day of their lives in front of cameras. They visited Angelica's grave, a small stone marker they'd had placed in Frankfurt Cemetery even though they had no body to bury, a memorial to a daughter who existed in that terrible limbo of missing, neither confirmed alive nor confirmed dead. The stone was simple, white marble, engraved with Angelica's name and dates, February 14, 1989, to May 3, 1992. And beneath that, a single line, "Forever in our hearts, forever missed, forever loved." They didn't list her as deceased because they couldn't bring themselves to do it, couldn't acknowledge that finality when there was still a chance, however microscopic, that she was alive somewhere. But they needed a place to go, a place to bring flowers, a place to sit and talk to their daughter even if she couldn't hear them. So the grave marker served as a memorial, a focal point for their grief, a physical space where they could channel the overwhelming emotion that had no other outlet. The investigation limped along through 1993 and into 1994. Detective Chen got promoted to sergeant, which meant more administrative duties and less time for active investigation. But she still worked Angelica's case whenever she could, still followed up on the occasional tip that came in, still met with Carol and Michael to update them even when there was nothing new to report. New theories emerged and were investigated. One theory suggested Angelica had been taken by a childless couple, desperate for a baby of their own, who'd seen her and impulsively decided to take her. This theory was supported by cases of similar abductions in other parts of the country, but without any specific suspects or evidence, it remained purely speculative. Another theory suggested connections to a human trafficking ring that law enforcement had been investigating in the region. The FBI had broken up several such rings in the early 90s, and there was speculation that Angelica might have been taken and sold to someone far from Kentucky, possibly even outside the country. This was the most horrifying theory because it suggested Angelica might still be alive, but living under a different name with people who weren't her parents, possibly being abused or exploited, possibly having no memory of her real family. Investigators followed these leads as aggressively as they could, but again, without specific evidence linking any known trafficking operations to Angelica's case, they reached dead ends. By the mid-90s, the case had truly gone cold in every meaningful sense. The file remained open, but no active investigation was taking place. Carol and Michael had separated, unable to survive the strain that Angelica's disappearance had put on their marriage. They loved each other still, but their grief manifested in incompatible ways, and being together meant constantly being reminded of what they'd lost. They divorced in 1995, dividing their assets and selling the house on Riverview Lane because neither of them could bear to live there anymore. Carol moved to Louisville, starting over in a new city where no one knew her story, where she could be anonymous, where she could try to build some kind of life even though a piece of her heart was forever missing. She got her dental hygienist license renewed and started working again, throwing herself into work because staying busy was the only way she could cope. She dated occasionally, half-heartedly, but every potential relationship ended when she had to explain about Angelica, when men who'd seemed interested suddenly became distant after learning she'd lost a child, after understanding that she would never fully move on, would never be whole again. Michael stayed in Frankfurt, unable to leave the place where Angelica had last been, as if staying somehow kept him connected to her. He remarried in 1998 to a kind woman named Janet, who'd lost her own son to cancer years earlier and who understood grief in a way that most people couldn't. They had a daughter together in 2000, and Michael loved her fiercely, but in a way that was forever colored by the loss of his first daughter. He was protective to the point of being overprotective, terrified of letting his new daughter out of his sight, checking on her obsessively, unable to shake the fear that history might repeat itself. Detective Chen, now Sergeant Chen, continued to check in on the case periodically. Every year on Angelica's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance, she'd pull the file out and review it again, looking with fresh eyes to see if there was anything she'd missed. Occasionally, new tips would come in, usually spurred by a slow news day when a local station would run a "Where Are They Now" segment on cold cases. Chen would investigate each tip thoroughly, but none of them led anywhere. The turn of the millennium brought new technologies that offered hope for solving old cases. DNA analysis had advanced significantly. Digital databases had become more sophisticated. The internet had become a tool that law enforcement could use to track people and share information in ways that hadn't been possible in 1992. Chen requested that Angelica's case be reviewed with these new tools, and it was, but there was simply no physical evidence to analyze, no DNA to test, no digital footprint to follow because digital footprints barely existed in 1992. The missing persons databases had expanded and become interconnected, and Angelica's information was in all of them. Her dental records were on file. Her physical description had been updated to show age-progressed images, computer-generated predictions of what she might look like at age 10, at age 15, at age 20. These images were distributed periodically, shared on social media when social media became a thing, posted on websites dedicated to missing children. But no one ever called to say they'd seen her. No one ever came forward to say they were her. By 2010, nearly 2 decades after Angelica's disappearance, Carol had settled into a quiet life in Louisville. She lived alone in a small apartment, worked at a dental practice where her colleagues were kind and professional, but not particularly close. She attended therapy regularly, had learned coping mechanisms for the grief that would never fully go away, had accepted that she would probably never know what happened to her daughter, but acceptance didn't mean peace. It just meant surviving. Michael was still in Frankfurt with Janet and their daughter Emma, now 10 years old. Emma knew she had an older half-sister who'd disappeared before Emma was born. Michael had told her about Angelica in age-appropriate ways as she'd grown up, showing her pictures, telling her stories, making sure that Angelica's memory stayed alive. Emma sometimes asked questions that Michael couldn't answer. Where did Angie go? Is she in heaven? Will we ever find her? And Michael would do his best to answer honestly while not burdening his young daughter with the full horror of not knowing. Sergeant Chen had retired from the Frankfurt Police Department in 2008 after 24 years of service, but she'd stayed in touch with the new detectives who'd inherited the cold case files. Angelica's case was in the hands of Detective Marcus Thompson now, a younger man who'd been in elementary school when Angelica disappeared, but who'd taken up the investigation with genuine commitment. Thompson would call Chen occasionally to ask about details from the original investigation, to get her perspective on theories or leads, and Chen was always happy to help. This case had haunted her throughout her career. It would haunt her in retirement, too. The 2010s brought another technological revolution in the form of social media. Facebook groups dedicated to solving cold cases sprang up, amateur detectives poring over publicly available information, developing theories, sometimes identifying previously unknown leads. Angelica's case was featured in several of these groups, discussed and analyzed by people who hadn't even been born when she disappeared, but who felt compelled to help. In 2015, a podcast called Vanished, Stories of Missing Children devoted 2 episodes to Angelica's case. The podcast was popular, reaching hundreds of thousands of listeners, bringing renewed attention to a case that had been largely forgotten outside of Frankfurt. The tip line received a surge of new calls, and Detective Thompson investigated every single one. None of them panned out. One lead seemed promising at first. A woman in Montana called to say she'd been abducted as a child in the early 90s and had just recently recovered memories of her early childhood that didn't match the family who'd raised her. She thought she might be Angelica. She had dark hair. She was approximately the right age. She had vague memories of Kentucky. Detective Thompson flew to Montana to interview her, brought along DNA samples that had been collected from Carol and Michael years earlier, just in case. But the DNA test came back negative. The woman wasn't Angelica. She was exactly who her family said she was, and her memories were likely false memories, the result of suggestion and wishful thinking and the human brain's tendency to construct narratives that might not be true. Carol had allowed herself to hope during the week between when the woman came forward and when the DNA results came back, had allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to see her daughter again, grown up now, 26 years old, an adult with her own life. Had imagined the reunion, the tears, the joy of having her daughter back after all these years. And when the results came back negative, when Detective Thompson had to call and tell her that no, this woman wasn't Angelica, the disappointment was crushing, fresh grief layered on top of old grief, a reminder that hope was dangerous when it came to cases like this. By 2020, nearly 30 years after Angelica's disappearance, everyone directly involved in the original investigation was either retired or had moved on. Detective Thompson had transferred to a different department. Angelica's case was now in the hands of Detective Rachel Martinez, David Martinez's daughter, who'd been 5 years old when Angelica disappeared and who'd grown up hearing her father talk about this case, about how it had affected him, about his determination to someday solve it. When Rachel had joined the Frankfurt Police Department and worked her way up to detective, taking on the cold case files had felt like destiny. Rachel approached the case with fresh eyes and modern technology. She requested that the case file be digitized, every document scanned and entered into a computer database where it could be easily searched and cross-referenced. She reached out to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, to see if there were any similar cases in their database that might be connected. She contacted forensic genealogy companies to see if there were any techniques that could be applied to this case. Though without physical evidence containing DNA, the options were limited. She also reached out to Carol and Michael, both now in their late 50s, to let them know she was reviewing the case. Carol was grateful but guarded, having had her hopes raised and dashed too many times over the decades. Michael was more optimistic, had never fully given up hope that someday, somehow, his daughter would be found. They met with Detective Martinez separately, as they'd been divorced for 25 years and maintained only minimal contact, usually just on Angelica's birthday and the anniversary of her disappearance when they'd text each other, acknowledging the date, sharing their grief in the only way they still could. Detective Martinez spent 6 months reviewing every aspect of the case. She re-interviewed some of the original witnesses who were still alive and still in the area. Mrs. Henderson had passed away in 2007. Mr. Dawson had moved to Florida to be near his children, but Mrs. Patterson was still alive, still living in the same house next to where the Lewis family had once lived, and she remembered that day, in May 1992, as clearly as if it had been yesterday. "I think about it all the time, Mrs. Patterson told Detective Martinez, sitting in her living room surrounded by photographs of her own grandchildren and great-grandchildren. "I was right there, right next door. If I'd been paying attention, if I'd seen something, maybe I could have stopped it. That little girl was so sweet. Her mother was such a nice woman. It destroyed that family. Destroyed the whole neighborhood, really. People moved away afterward, didn't feel safe anymore. Even though nothing like that has happened since, people never forgot." Detective Martinez also re-investigated the yard work man who'd never been identified. She ran the enhanced image through facial recognition software, comparing it to driver's license databases, arrest records, any photograph that existed in any law enforcement database. She got thousands of potential matches, but after investigating the most promising ones, none of them panned out. Either the match wasn't actually close when you looked at it carefully, or the person had a solid alibi for May 3, 1992, or the person had died years ago and couldn't be questioned. The dark sedan was another angle Martinez explored. She pulled registration records from 1992. For every blue or green sedan in the region, a list of several thousand vehicles. Most of those cars were long gone now, scrapped or sold or sitting in junkyards. The owners from 1992 were older now, if they were still alive at all, and their memories of where they'd been on one specific Sunday afternoon 3 decades ago were understandably hazy at best. One theory that Martinez found particularly interesting was the possibility that Angelica's abduction was connected to other unsolved cases from the same time period. She identified 4 cases from surrounding states between 1990 and 1994, where young children had been abducted in similar circumstances, taken from seemingly safe locations in small towns, no witnesses, no physical evidence, never recovered. The geographic pattern formed a rough circle with Frankfurt at the center, and Martinez wondered if they were looking at a serial predator who'd been operating in the region during those years. She contacted the investigators working those cold cases, shared information, looked for commonalities. All of the victims were between 2 and 5 years old. All were girls. All were white. All were taken during daylight hours. All disappeared without a trace. But the similarities ended there. Different methods of abduction. Different time frames. No physical evidence in any of the cases that could be compared. And most frustratingly, different descriptions of potential suspects in the cases where there were any suspects at all. It was possible they were connected, It was equally possible the similarities were coincidental, that multiple predators had been operating independently in the region during the early 90s. Martinez documented her findings in a comprehensive report and submitted it to the FBI for review. The response was polite, but non-committal. Without physical evidence linking the cases, without more specific patterns that would indicate a serial offender, the FBI couldn't dedicate resources to investigating a potential connection. The cases would remain separate, investigated individually, unless new evidence emerged that definitively connected them. 2021 brought the COVID pandemic, which slowed many cold case investigations as law enforcement resources were redirected to dealing with the immediate crisis. But it also brought people online in unprecedented numbers, spending time in their homes, scrolling through social media, becoming amateur detectives on platforms like TikTok and Reddit. Angelica's case found a new audience, a generation of true crime enthusiasts who'd never heard her story before, but who became invested in trying to solve it. One TikTok user created a series of videos about Angelica's disappearance that went viral, garnering millions of views. The attention brought another surge of tips, another round of investigation, another cycle of hope and disappointment. Some of the tips were legitimate. People who'd lived in Frankfurt in 1992 and who remembered details they'd never reported at the time. Most of the tips were less helpful. People who'd read about the case online and thought they'd seen Angelica at a grocery store or a gas station, not seeming to understand that if Angelica was still alive, she'd be 32 years old now, not the 3-year-old in the pictures they'd seen. Detective Martinez investigated everything methodically. It was tedious work, frustrating work, work that more often than not led nowhere. But it was necessary work because somewhere in the mountain of tips and theories and speculation might be the one piece of information that would finally crack this case open. In 2022, 30 years after Angelica's disappearance, Frankfurt held a memorial service at the community church. Carol drove up from Louisville for it. Michael attended with Janet and Emma, who was now a college student studying criminal justice, partially inspired by her half-sister's story. Sergeant Chen came, now in her 70s but still sharp, still invested in this case that had defined so much of her career. Other officers who'd worked the investigation over the years attended. Community members who remembered Angelica attended. And Detective Martinez attended, standing at the back of the church, watching the gathering, seeing the impact that one little girl's disappearance had had on so many lives. Reverend Mitchell had retired, and the current pastor, a younger man who'd never known Angelica, led the service. But he'd done his research, had talked to people who remembered her, and he spoke movingly about how one small life could touch so many others, how the search for justice could span decades, how hope could persist even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They sang hymns, they lit candles, they said prayers, and they remembered a little girl with dark, curly hair and pink ribbons who disappeared on a spring afternoon 3 decades ago and had never come home. After the service, Carol and Michael spoke briefly, the first time they'd been face-to-face in over a year. The conversation was awkward, weighted with shared history and shared trauma, and the lives they'd lived separately for the past 27 years. But there was still love there, buried under layers of grief and time, love for each other, love for the daughter they'd created together, love that would never fully die no matter how many years passed. "Do you ever think we'll know what happened to her?" Carol asked. Michael looked at her. This woman he'd once been married to, this woman who'd been his whole world before their world had fallen apart. "I have to believe we will," he said. "Maybe not today, but someday. We have to believe that." Detective Martinez had approached both of them after the service, introducing herself, explaining her commitment to the case, promising that she would never stop investigating, never let Angelica's case be forgotten. Carol appreciated the sentiment, but had heard similar promises from other detectives over the years. She was grateful for Martinez's dedication, but no longer allowed herself to hope for a breakthrough. Michael, on the other hand, clung to Martinez's words. He needed to believe that justice was still possible, that answers were still out there, that his daughter's story would eventually have an ending, even if it wasn't the ending he'd prayed for all these years. By 2023, advances in technology offered new possibilities. Artificial intelligence could now analyze patterns in data that human investigators might miss. Genetic genealogy had solved numerous cold cases, identifying suspects through DNA matches with distant relatives in public databases. Enhanced satellite imagery and historical mapping data could reconstruct what areas looked like decades ago, potentially identifying locations that hadn't been thoroughly searched during the original investigation. Detective Martinez applied for grants to fund the use of these technologies on Angelica's case. Some of the applications were approved. Some were denied. She worked with what she had, running the case data through AI algorithms designed to identify connections and patterns. The AI flagged several potential leads that had been overlooked in the original investigation, including a small detail about a maintenance worker who'd been doing repairs on power lines in the neighborhood the week before Angelica's disappearance. Martinez tracked down this maintenance worker, now in his 60s and living in Tennessee, and interviewed him. He remembered being in Frankfurt in May 1992, but had no memory of anything unusual, certainly hadn't seen or taken a 3-year-old girl. He consented to a DNA test, which came back negative for any familial relationship to Angelica. The genetic genealogy avenue was frustrating because, without Angelica's DNA, without knowing who the perpetrator was, there was nothing to test and compare. If they'd had physical evidence from the abduction, if there'd been DNA left at the scene or on Angelica's stuffed rabbit that had been abandoned on the porch, it could have been run through genealogy databases. But there was no such evidence. The case was maddeningly evidence-free. What Martinez did have was hope and determination, and a growing network of people invested in solving this case. She'd connected with other cold case detectives across the country, sharing information, learning from their successes and their failures. She'd built relationships with true crime podcasters and bloggers who kept Angelica's story in the public eye. She'd engaged with the online communities that were constantly analyzing and discussing the case, sorting through their theories to find ones that actually had merit. 2024 brought an unexpected development. A man in Ohio, dying of cancer, made a deathbed confession to his priest about crimes he'd committed decades earlier. The priest, after much moral wrestling, decided that the severity of the crimes outweighed the sanctity of confession and contacted law enforcement. The man confessed to multiple child abductions in the 1980s and 90s, providing details that had never been made public. When Ohio police contacted Detective Martinez to see if Angelica's case might be connected, she felt a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. She traveled to Ohio immediately, bringing the case file, bringing photographs, bringing every piece of information they had about Angelica's disappearance. The dying man, whose name was Robert Hensley, was 68 years old and had maybe weeks to live. He'd been a truck driver in the early 90s, traveling throughout the Midwest, and he'd used his profession as cover for his crimes. He'd confessed to abducting 5 children between 1987 and 1995, described where he'd taken them, what he'd done to them, where he'd left their remains. It was horrifying, nightmare-inducing information, and the Ohio police were in the process of trying to verify his claims and locate the children he'd described. Martinez showed him Angelica's picture. "Do you remember this little girl?" Frankfurt, Kentucky, May 1992. Hensley looked at the photograph for a long time, his eyes yellowed from disease, his hands shaking. "No," he finally said. "I wasn't in Kentucky that year. I was running routes through Wisconsin and Minnesota in '92. I'm sorry. I wish I could help. But that girl, she wasn't me." Martinez believed him. As horrible as he was, as much as she wanted him to be the answer, she believed him when he said he hadn't taken Angelica. She stayed for 2 more days, interviewing him extensively, comparing his methods to what they knew about Angelica's case, and the more she learned, the more convinced she became that he wasn't involved. His pattern was different. His victim selection was different. His timeline didn't match. He confessed readily to the crimes he had committed, had no reason to deny involvement in Angelica's case if he'd been responsible for it. The trip to Ohio was devastating in its own way. Martinez had allowed herself to hope, had thought maybe this was finally the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. But it was just another dead end in a case full of them. She returned to Frankfurt, exhausted and discouraged, but after a few days of wallowing, she picked herself up and went back to work. Because that's what you did. Because giving up wasn't an option. Because Angelica deserved better. As we approach 2025, 33 years after Angelica Lewis vanished from her front porch, the case remains unsolved. Carol is 61 now, still living in Louisville, still working as a dental hygienist, still carrying the weight of not knowing what happened to her daughter. Michael is 64, still in Frankfurt with Janet, watching his daughter Emma graduate from college with a degree in criminal justice, hoping that maybe Emma's generation will be the one that finally solves these impossible cases. Sergeant Chen is in her late 70s, following Angelica's case from retirement, still hoping to see it solved before she dies. And Detective Martinez continues to work the case, continues to investigate new leads, continues to hope that someday, somehow, they'll find the answer. The case file for Angelica Lewis is thick, thousands of pages of reports and interviews and theories and dead ends. It sits in the cold case division of the Frankfurt Police Department, alongside dozens of other unsolved cases, a testament to crimes that have gone unpunished, to questions that remain unanswered, to families that have never received closure. But it's not forgotten. Angelica's name is still spoken. Her story is still told. And there are still people who refuse to give up, who believe that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, who continue to search for answers even after more than 3 decades have passed. Because somewhere, there's someone who knows what happened to Angelica Lewis. Maybe it's the person who took her. Maybe it's someone who saw something that day and didn't realize its significance. Maybe it's someone who's been carrying the weight of a terrible secret for 33 years. But someone knows. And until that someone comes forward, until that secret is revealed, Angelica's case will remain cold but never closed, unsolved but never forgotten. The story of Angelica Lewis is a tragedy that has touched countless lives. It's a reminder that evil exists in the world, that terrible things can happen in the most ordinary places, that safety is sometimes an illusion. But it's also a story about persistence, about communities coming together, about investigators who refuse to give up, about a family's love that transcends time and tragedy. If you have information about Angelica Lewis's disappearance, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Frankfurt Police Department or the FBI. There's still a $75,000 reward for information leading to her recovery or to the arrest and conviction of the person responsible for her disappearance. The tip line remains active. The investigation remains open, and somewhere, a mother and father are still waiting for their daughter to come home. This is Cold Case, and we're committed to keeping these stories alive, to giving voice to victims who can't speak for themselves, to supporting the families who live every day with unanswered questions. If this case has affected you, if you believe in the power of community to solve these seemingly unsolvable crimes, then I'm asking you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Second, share this video everywhere you can, because the more people who see Angelica's face and hear her story, the more likely it is that someone with information will finally come forward. And third, never stop caring. Never stop paying attention. Never let these cold cases fade into obscurity. Because every victim deserves justice, every family deserves answers, and every cold case deserves a community of people who refuse to forget. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And please, if you know anything about what happened to Angelica Lewis on May 3, 1992, speak up. It's never too late to do the right thing.